Part 4. I try to explain it away in the morning. Sunlight helps. It always does. Fear that feels enormous at 3 in the morning shrinks down to something manageable once the sun comes up and the birds start making noise outside your window and the world remembers to be ordinary again. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tape had multiple tracks and the player was randomly choosing which one to play, like a shuffle feature on an old machine that malfunctioned in some strange way. Maybe I'd told someone about the thrift stores and forgotten, and that person had somehow... No, that didn't make sense either. Nobody could record onto an old cassette tape and place it inside a sealed box in an attic that hadn't been touched in years, matching my private thoughts and unspoken memories word for word. I called my mother's old friend, Denise, a woman who had known her since college, back when he used to share an apartment above a laundromat and split the rent by counting quarters at the kitchen table. I asked if she knew anything about a cassette tape my mother might have recorded before she died, maybe as some kind of final gift. Denise sounded confused. She said my mother hadn't mentioned anything like that, not once, and besides, my mother had been in the hospital for the last 6 weeks of her life. Far too sick and far too heavily medicated to be organizing secret recordings, let alone smuggling a wooden box up into an attic she could barely climb stairs to reach anymore. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, some strange, hopeful part of me wanted to believe it really was magic. That my mother had found some way to reach me from beyond, to keep talking to me, to keep being my mother even after death, defying every rule of biology and physics just to stay a little longer in my life. Grief makes you want to believe in impossible things. It makes the impossible feel like comfort instead of danger, like a door left open instead of a trap sprung shut. That afternoon, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went to the library and looked through old newspaper archives for our town, searching for anything about strange recordings, haunted objects, families losing loved ones under odd circumstances. It felt silly even as I typed the search terms into the microfilm computer. Most of what came up was nothing. Obituaries, church bake sale announcements, a decades-old article about a house fire 2 streets over from where my mother used to live. But one small clipping caught my eye. It was from almost 40 years ago, barely 2 paragraphs long, buried on page 9 of a local paper that didn't exist anymore. The headline read, "Local woman's death ruled accidental after months of strange behavior." The article was thin on details, the kind of vague small-town reporting that leaves more questions than answers. But it mentioned a woman named Eleanor Voss who had, according to neighbors, become withdrawn and obsessed with an old recording in the months before she was found dead in her home. No cause of death was listed. The article ended abruptly, as if the reporter had been told to stop asking questions. I stared at that clipping for a long time. I told myself it meant nothing. Coincidences happen. Old towns have old tragedies, dozens of them, buried in every issue of every dead newspaper. But I wrote down the name anyway, Eleanor Voss, on a scrap of paper I folded into my pocket, and I didn't throw it away for a long, long time. Part 4.5. The house on Larkspur Street before that, though curiosity got the better of me one more time. I found the old address listed for Eleanor Voss in a city directory from decades ago, and I drove past it on my lunch break the next day, telling myself I was just being thorough, just closing a loop, nothing more. The house was still standing, a narrow 2-story with faded blue siding, a chain-link fence around a yard gone to weeds. It looked ordinary, sad, maybe the way old houses look when nobody has loved them in a long time, but ordinary. An old man was raking leaves next door, moving slowly, the way people move when their bodies have started arguing with them. I parked and walked over, feeling foolish before I even opened my mouth, and asked if he'd known the woman who used to live in the blue house. He stopped raking. He looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you're deciding how much truth they can handle. His name was Walter, and he told me he'd lived on that street his whole life, 71 years, and that he remembered Eleanor Voss the way you remember a storm that passed close to your own house without quite touching it. He said she'd been a normal woman once, cheerful, always waving from her porch, always bringing over extra vegetables from her garden. Then, in the last year of her life, something changed. She stopped coming outside during the day. Her lights would be on at strange hours, 3, 4 in the morning, and Walter's late wife used to hear, very faintly across the yard on quiet nights, the sound of a woman talking to someone in an empty room. Talking like a conversation, he said, leaning on his rake. Back and forth. Except there wasn't ever anybody else in that house with her. Not after her husband passed. Just her and the girl. I asked about the girl. Margaret. Walter's face did something complicated, somewhere between sadness and something older and more careful than sadness. She stopped going to school, he said. Then Eleanor was gone. Found her in the kitchen one morning. They said though nobody in this neighborhood ever believed the official word on how it happened. And the girl, he shook his head slowly. The girl was gone before the funeral. Family came and took her, people said, relatives from out of state. I never saw her again after that, and neither did anybody else on this street. Not once, not in 71 years. You'd think a person would come back, even once, to visit a grave. She never did, or maybe she never could. I thanked him and walked back to my car on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own. I did not sleep well that night, long before the tape ever spoke to me about it directly. Something about the phrase, or maybe she never could, followed me home and sat in the passenger seat the whole drive back, and it has never quite gotten out of the car since. Part 5. The voice learns my name that night's recording started the same way. Static, then her voice. Sarah, it said, you called Denise today. She doesn't remember me telling her anything, does she? That's all right. I never told anyone about you and me. Not really. Some things are just between a mother and her daughter. My whole body went rigid. There was no way it could know about the phone call. No possible way, unless it was somehow inside my life in a manner I couldn't understand or explain. You're scared now? The voice continued, and something about its tone had changed. It was still my mother's voice, exactly her pitch, exactly her softness, but underneath it, there was something colder, something patient, the way a predator is patient, waiting in tall grass for the exact right moment. You don't need to be scared, sweetheart. I just want to keep talking to you. Isn't that what you wanted? Didn't you want one more conversation with your mother? Didn't you pray for it some nights after I got sick? Didn't you lie in bed and beg, whatever's listening to just let you talk to me one more time? I had. God help me, I had. I had prayed exactly that more than once in the darkest weeks after the diagnosis, when I understood for the first time that she was actually going to die and there was nothing anyone could do about it. I had never told a single living soul that I prayed that. I had been ashamed of it. Somehow, like wanting more time was a selfish, greedy thing to want from God. I know things now that I never knew when I was alive, the voice said. I know you didn't visit me as much as you wanted people to think those last 2 months. I know you cried more about missing work than about missing me some days, and then you hated yourself for it in the parking garage before you came inside. I know you feel guilty about that. You don't have to feel guilty. I forgive you. I forgive you for all of it, sweetheart. Doesn't that feel good to hear? Doesn't that feel like exactly what you needed? That was too much. I reached for the stop button, my hand hesitating over it for one long, terrible second. Some deep, animal part of my brain told me not to touch it, not to interrupt whatever this was, that interrupting it might make it angry. And then I slammed my palm down, and the tape cut off mid-sentence with an ugly mechanical screech that didn't sound like any tape player malfunction I had ever heard before. It sounded almost like a scream, cut short. I sat there panting in the dark, my heart slamming against my ribs. The things it said, they were true. All of them. Things I had never told a living soul. Things I was ashamed of. Things I had buried so deep I barely admitted them to myself in the privacy of my own head. This wasn't a recording of my mother's love. This was something else, wearing her voice like a mask, something that had access to the inside of my mind in a way that made my skin crawl to even think about. I threw the tape and the boombox into a garbage bag that night, tied it shut in 3 separate knots, and put it out on the curb before I could talk myself out of it. Part 6. It comes back 3 days later. I open my apartment door to leave for work, and the garbage bag was sitting on my doorstep. I hadn't touched it. I had watched the garbage truck take it away myself, standing in my window with my morning coffee, feeling relieved as it disappeared down the street with a hydraulic groan, feeling, for the first time in days, like I could breathe normally again. But there it was. Same bag. Same 3 knots. Inside, the boombox and the tape completely undamaged, like nothing had ever happened to them. No crushing, no compacting, not even a dent from the truck's mechanism. I should have thrown it in a river. I should have driven 2 hours out of town and left it in a dumpster behind a stranger's business, somewhere it could never trace back to my address. Looking back, I know that now. But something about finding it on my doorstep, untouched, waiting for me like a loyal dog that had somehow found its way home across an impossible distance, made me feel like fighting it was pointless. Like it had already decided I would listen again, and there was nothing I could do to stop that from happening eventually. Like this had already happened before, to someone else, and the ending was already written. I carried the bag inside. I didn't unpack it right away. I let it sit in my closet for almost 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, strange things started happening around my apartment. Small at first, then less small. I would wake up and find the bathroom mirror slightly fogged, like someone had just taken a hot shower, even though I lived alone and hadn't showered yet that day. I would hear very faintly at the edge of sleep a sound like a cassette tape rewinding, the little whirring clicks of the reels turning backward, coming from somewhere inside the walls, or maybe from inside my own skull. I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. Once I found a single strand of gray hair on my pillow. My mother had gray hair threaded through with white near the end. Mine is dark brown, no gray at all, not at 26. Another night, I woke at exactly 3:17 in the morning, a time that would come to matter very much later, to the smell of my mother's perfume filling my bedroom, so strong and so specific that for one half-asleep second, I genuinely believed she was standing at the foot of my bed. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding, and there was nothing there, just the smell, fading slowly, like she had walked through the room seconds before I opened my eyes, and I had simply missed her by a heartbeat. I started sleeping with the lights on. I started avoiding my own apartment, staying late at work, go to my friend Priya's place instead of going home most nights. But apartments cost money, and eventually you have to go home. Part 7, Priya doesn't believe me until she does. I told Priya everything one night over wine at her kitchen table, half expecting her to tell me I needed therapy, which honestly might have been the correct response given how I sounded even to my own ears. Instead, she got very quiet. She set her glass down slowly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to say something they're not sure they should say. Her grandmother, she told me, used to tell a story about a haunted radio back in the old country, something that would speak in the voices of the dead and slowly reveal that it knew everything about the person listening. Her grandmother called it a voice thief. She said the old stories warned that once it had your attention, it would try to get closer to you, learning more and more, until it knew you well enough to replace someone in your life, to slide into the shape of a person you loved, and wear that shape until nobody, including you, could tell the difference anymore. Replace someone how? I asked, my mouth dry. Priya shrugged, uncomfortable, wrapping both hands around her wine glass like it could warm something in her that had gone cold. The stories never really explained that part. They just said don't feed it. Don't give it your attention. Don't let it keep learning, because every time you listen, you're handing it another piece of the puzzle, and eventually it has enough pieces to build a whole person. I laughed it off at the time, mostly because I needed to laugh at something, needed the fear in my chest to loosen even for a second, needed this to still be the kind of story you tell over wine and then forget by morning. But that night, lying in Priya's guest room, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase, don't feed it. Every time I listened to that tape, it learned something new about me, my habits, my secrets, my fears, and each time, the voice sounded a little more confident, a little more like it belonged in my life, rather than being an intruder inside it. I thought about Eleanor Voss, the woman from the newspaper clipping, dead almost 40 years ago after months of strange behavior and an obsession with an old recording. I thought about how thin that article had been, how quickly the story had disappeared from the record, as if someone, at some point, had decided it was safer not to keep asking questions about it. The next morning, I asked Priya if her grandmother was still alive, if maybe she could tell me more of the old story, anything at all that might help. Priya went quiet again and told me her grandmother had passed away 4 years ago, but she remembered one more detail, something her grandmother had always insisted on whenever she told the story to the grandchildren, half joke and half deadly serious. Never say its name back to it. Never repeat what it says. Never answer it directly, because answering is a kind of feeding too, maybe the most dangerous kind. Just listening in silence was bad enough. Talking back was worse.